A new United Nations report has found that African migrants who often take dangerous routes to reach Europe are doing so not because they are feeling danger, but rather because their home countries are not able to meet their aspirations quickly enough.
The United Nations Development Programme's report, Scaling Fences, Voices of Irregular African Migrants to Europe, presents the results of an extensive study exploring the perspectives and experiences of almost 2,000 individuals from 39 African countries who migrated through irregular routes to Europe.
It's a report that aims to address misconceptions around irregular African migration to Europe, and is the second major review of contemporary development issues affecting Africa to be published by the UNDP's Regional Bureau for Africa.
It is not necessarily the most desperate, the least educated, the most starving who actually make up the majority of irregular migrants. And again, this should not surprise us. It is, in a sense, common sense. Whether you look back to the Irish famine, which shaped so much also of this country's early migration. If you look back to many other diasporas that have taken place, often it is those who have either been able to get some education, get some sense of another horizon, have perhaps some savings, have the energy, the courage to take the risk of undertaking this journey, who get up and leave.
Among the key findings of this report is that 58% of respondents were either in school or earning at the time of their departure. For 66%, earning or the prospect of earning at home was not a factor that constrained their decision to migrate. 62% felt unfairly treated by their governments, while 77% felt their country's political system provided no opportunity through which they could exert influence.
In addition, they were overwhelmingly from urban areas in Africa.
We do know that prominent among them were many young Africans, men and women in their prime, all of whom had weighed their odds and arrived at the same conclusion: that risking death for an uncertain future in a foreign land held greater promise than the life and opportunities they faced at home in their own countries. Now, as a development practitioner, and for all those who are leaders in our world today, this is an indictment of great proportions.
With barriers to opportunity, the question of choicelessness being a prominent feature both in countries of origin and when they arrive at their destination.
The migration crisis is disrupting African development progress in ways we're just beginning to grasp. It is essential that we gain a clearer understanding of its drivers so that we and other development partners can respond more effectively. And in my view, it is about that all-important word, hope.
About 93% of those who migrated experienced danger en route to their destination, but only 2% indicated that those risks would, in hindsight, have caused them to stay home, with the report pointing to the need for greater legal pathways in Europe to address the need.
The cliché profile of the irregular migrant does not fit the story of the most desperate moving, which kind of complicates the simplistic discussion that we've often heard. If only we can make development happen in those countries, migration will stop. Yes, it will influence it, it will shape it, but not in ways that are mechanical or in a quantitative sense simply a function of more millions into countries of origin, less migrants in the countries that receive them. Indeed, the fascinating thing about Scaling the Fences is it is the story of development, and it is the contemporary articulation through the eyes of those who are irregular migrants of the development state of thinking and experience of the 21st century we live in right now.
A report with implications for African countries, particularly on development, but also for Europe, where too often the politics and policies around migration have failed to address the issue comprehensively. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
For more on this story, we cross live to our correspondent in New York, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us on The Globe. Now, the UNDP report referenced about 1,970 migrants from 39 African countries in 13 European nations. But does it comprehensively detail why they undertake those dangerous routes from Africa to Europe?
UN Development Programme's resident representative in Nigeria and the lead author of the report, Scaling Fences, Voices of Irregular African Migrants to Europe. Mohammed, a very warm welcome. Congratulations on this report. And I think it begs the question, why now?
Well, we started the report knowing very much the impact this kind of migrations have had on politics and how much perception it informs policy. So what we wanted to give political leaders and the decision makers both in Africa and in Europe is a clear understanding in terms of who these people are, why are they leaving Africa, and what is their aspirations while in Europe and how they see the future. And this is supposed to equip them with the right evidence to be able to make a well-informed policy choices.
So what are the main takeaways from this report, right? People think about African migration to Europe, they think about boats packed with people, hundreds of them drowning in the Mediterranean, and you're saying that the perception that has created is wrong, right? These are people perhaps fleeing climate change or fleeing conflicts or are internally displaced and therefore on the move. You're saying that no, these are actually urban people that have access to some levels of education. They are fairly skilled, and they are making a choice to move because they felt that they've reached the development ceiling in their own country, right?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there are some, obviously, that we did not interview. We interviewed them, but we did not use them for the sample size that informed the report. I'm sure, and this has been recorded, there are many people who live in conflict, be it Libya, be it Somalia, be it other conflict-impacted country. But for this specific report, we chose to look at people who have self-declared the main reason to be development-related, economic-related. And for those, what we are finding out is that the ceiling at home, as you put it, and the power of their dream is much more incentivizing than any risk that may be associated by the journey itself.
What I also found fascinating was that this is a cause, that the reason this irregular migration is taking place is not because of a lack of development, but is actually happening because of development in Africa. Can you explain what you mean precisely by that?
Yes, because I think sometimes we focus too much on extreme poverty and the relationship between extreme poverty and how it impacts people. But this group specifically, the issue is not deprivation as we understand it, is a deprivation of opportunity. So this is a group of people who have understand their relative deprivation compared to what the globe offers, and are very much have benefited from Africa's development in the recent decade, but are saying that being a young person, being somebody who is educated, I don't see me achieving my dreams here. And that the report looks into what are those bottlenecks at home that is stopping them from achieving their dreams at home. And this is what we're seeing.
And you're also saying that this type of migration is no different to past migration, say, from Europe to the New World, right? People are ambitious, they have dreams, they want to go and pursue those dreams, but the narrative through which, the lens through which we look at African migration isn't quite that. Why is that?
Because sometimes we forget about our own history as humans. We don't tend to have a long memory. And you're absolutely right. Many Europeans left to seek a better life, reimagine their life in a new world, where their background, be it religious minorities from Europe, or their background for whatever country they may have come from in Europe. What these young people are doing is to say that in Europe I can restart, I can reimagine, and I can potentially achieve something for myself. And what we see in the report is, even when they experience the danger of the journey, even when they reach Europe in an unknown land, impacted by some deprivation they see themselves. For example, many live roughly, 11% have been homeless, some don't have 3 meals a day, but in Europe they see that their dream can be achieved. And that
they see the potential.
Exactly. They see a pathway to their dream. The imagination of their future is clear in Europe. That's an indictment. As an African, as many Africans watching this program, that's a huge indictment of why our young people feel though they cannot achieve their dreams at home.
So what then do African governments have to do with this new information, right? They're saying, well, we're developing, and we've reached a point of development that is enabling these people to move. What then do we still have to do to ensure that they actually stay? Is this report about ensuring that they stay, or understanding the policy mechanisms that are required on both ends?
So we obviously, this is why one of the report discourages the concept of managing migration. What we say is that these are young people. Africa has invested in them. Africa has educated them. But Africa is not delivering their hope at home.
So what do you have to do then to retain them, right?
So be competitive. This is what we say. Be competitive for them. And one of the biggest problems we face in the continent is that we still remain a very inhospitable environment for young people. It's not a place where, I mean, if you look at the gap between those who lead and those who are led, it's the largest generational gap anywhere in the world. If you look at cultural constraints for young people are still very big. If you look at acceleration, economic opportunities are not going at the fast rate that we need to go. Every day, 33,000 Africans enter the job market. Only 60% of them won't find a job. So the ambition part and making Africa, its policies, its frameworks, compatible to the ambitions of this young, dynamic population is what will define our future. And what they're telling us in these stories is, if I don't find it here, I'll find it somewhere else. And that is where the danger for Africa is if this number grows.
The only problem with that is, as much as they're seeking this somewhere else, when they get to Europe, they're not finding the avenues through which to pursue these dreams. They are just encountering more obstacles. So what is this report saying to European policymakers about the greater need for legal pathways? What is the nexus, I guess, is the question between the politics of Europe and the policy required in Europe?
So what the report first is telling European policymakers is these young people are not, they could potentially be a contributor to Europe's own development and Europe's own needs. But they are not people who are coming that are low-level education. So that's one part. The other part is to say that what we have seen so far is that why are they coming and how potentially they may go back in the future is what European policymakers have been given through this data. One of the key, for example, outcomes were sometimes in Europe you see policies that are meant to disincentivize people from coming, such as not having any other legal pathway except asylum. What that does is actually have a different impact. What the report shows is those who are working and sending money back home are more likely to see their presence in Europe as a temporary. Those who do not have the legal right to work and communities have invested in them to come to Europe are more likely to stay. The shame of going back empty-handed is a significant barrier. The shame of going home and seeing that people have invested in you and you have nothing to contribute as a result of that so this is the kind of vicious cycle, both in Africa and in Europe, of policies that are informed by lack of evidence. And this report is giving them real evidence to say, now let's have different dialogue on how migration happens and what is it that can be done.
Let me ask you just a couple of more questions before we wrap. What emerged earlier today in the panel discussion when we launched this report was this the sense that there's a lack of dialogue between African policymakers and European policymakers, right? This report is, in a way, an attempt to bridge that gap. To what extent is there a lack of communication between these two sides, if you will? If we can, for use of a better word, to call them sides.
I think first it was a lack of evidence for both sides. So everybody has an assumption of what is good for them.
And not an understanding of what's actually going on.
For many Africans remittance plays a big part in the African economy. Maybe more migration may be helpful. And for European policymakers, what can we do in Africa to make people stay? That has also governed programmatic responses. So what this does shows them is that first is not only about jobs. So these people are already working many times, but it's also quality of jobs. So that helps European policymakers in understanding what kind of incentives that could work. And it also helps Africans in understanding that you are not losing you're losing essentially your most productive potentially. So there should be a process where they can reach an agreement whereby you'll have win-win. And for us who are development actors, especially for UNDP, the report tells us we need to do much more in how development is understood. We need to invest much more in how we accelerate Africa's growth, because these are the kind of young people that Africa should be more competitive in keeping them.
And of course the politics of fear has a role to play. I mean, one of the outcomes certainly from that panel discussion was that there's a lack of understanding, there's a lack of education in terms of who is coming and why they are coming and the skills that they offer to local economies. Education is really, really key as a final point.
Absolutely. I mean, I was talking to some of the participants today, is the unknown nature of it also creates anxiety. People walking, and I mean, if you're watching television and you're an ordinary European, you see people coming off boats, coming into your country, and you don't know who they are. You don't
that
understand.
Sometimes is the only narrative that people get on this issue.
Absolutely, and that creates a justifiable anxiety. I don't even know who's coming to my country, and I think this report also offers them a sense of who's coming and where potential avenues for a win-win structure exists.
Is there a need for reports from other regions? I mean, there was also some questions about why focus on Africa going to Europe.
Well, first, from our side, there's a lot of reports written about inter-African migration, how migration works in the African context. But what this report does is close a gap in specifically African migration to Europe, and there's been a lot of visibility around it. We've seen the terrible deaths, the drownings around the Sahara, around the Mediterranean, and we've seen the human rights abuses in North Africa and some other countries related to African migrants recently reported. So this is a contribution to understanding on their motivation and why they are committed to change their condition for a betterment of the future they see for themselves.
Well, let me be the first to thank you for educating us all.
Thank you very
Mohammed,
much.
thank you so much indeed. Mohammed Yahya is the UN Development Programme's resident representative in Nigeria and, of course, the lead author of this report, Scaling Fences, Voices of Irregular African Migrants to Europe. I lost comms, Mpiwe, so I can't hear you, but it's back to you.
All right, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, thank you so much for joining us. That was our correspondent in New York.